In the previous episode, when we modeled Molly's nightstand, we skipped over the details of modeling the drawer. When you pull the drawer out, you'll notice there's no empty space behind it. But what if we needed the drawer to open? Today, in episode 6 of the Blender Story course, we're going to work on this, Andy's nightstand. Since we've leveled up a bit, this time we'll model the drawer with more detail and making it more realistic, so we can confidently open it and show it off when needed. Cool, right? In this episode, you'll learn lots of new things as always. We'll cover a cool tool called Extrude, explore more options with the powerful Bevel Modifier, learn about using the bridge tool to create holes in a mesh, get familiar with a new type of object in Blender called curve, learn more about the cursor, and get an introduction to viewport setting to make your objects look even better. Plus, we'll share some cool tricks and techniques, including a secret method to help you avoid problems and mistakes when using tools, making you smarter than others. But let me give you a friendly suggestion. If you haven't watched the previous episodes, please don't waste your time watching this one. The structure of this course is heavily dependent on previous and upcoming episodes. So, if you want the best results, make sure you're watching all the episodes in order, and most importantly, make sure that you're working on the projects along with the course. Alright? As always, you can download the blueprints from our ArtStation or Gumraod page, which I've included the links in the description. So, go ahead and download them, and then come back to continue. Since you already learned how to model Molly's nightstand in the previous episode, getting the model to this stage shouldn't be hard for you, right? I'll quickly review the modeling up to this point to make sure there are no mistakes in your work, and then we'll dive into the main topic. First, I imported the blueprints into the scene, positioned them, and placed them in their own collection. I also renamed them according to their view, and clicked on this icon so the blueprints wouldn't be selected. It's the same setup as always, right? Then I created a new collection, selected it, and started my work. For the legs, I simply created a cube, adjust its height and thickness according to the reference, and then added our favorite Bevel Modifier to soften the edges. And I didn't forget to apply Shade Auto Smooth. Next, I moved the origin of the leg to the center of the scene and applied a mirror modifier with the X and Y axis, placing it in all 4 corners. For the top part, I used a simple cube, adjusted its thickness according to the reference, and applied the Bevel Modifier and Shade Auto Smooth as well. So far, nothing new, right? For this part, I also created a simple box and matched it to the reference. But since we'll be creating a hole for the drawer, I haven't applied any modifiers yet. The drawer itself is just a simple box with no modifiers applied for now. Okay? If you're still not sure how to model these parts, I suggest going back to the previous episodes. And guys, did you notice what happened? Since your brain is now more comfortable with the software, you understood how to model this up to this point in just 1 minute. Wow! Before, even navigating in the 3D viewport was tough for us. It feels like magic, doesn't it? Okay, now we're ready to start our work. First, let's start by making the space for the drawer to fit into. I'll select these 2 objects and press the / key to enter local mode. Now I need to create a face in the middle that I can adjust it to make space for the drawer. As you learned in the previous episode, you can activate the loop cut tool by pressing Ctrl R and add an edge loop around the drawer to create this face. But this method isn't very precise, and it's not recommended for people with OCD. Because how do we know if the edge loops are equally distant from the edges on both sides? So we can use a new tool for this. First, I'll undo to remove the loops we created. Then I'll press Ctrl R, create an edge loop here, and remember to left click and then right click to place the edge loop in the center. I'll create another edge loop in the center here as well. And now, since this edge loop is still selected, move your mouse slightly above it, and instead of pressing Ctrl R, press Ctrl Shift R. Then move your mouse upwards. Very cool, right? This tool is called Offset Edge Slide. It's super useful, okay? I'll click here, and now I'm sure the distance between these edges and the borders is equal. Alright, there are 2 important things to remember when using this tool to avoid getting stuck. The first one is, if your mouse was above this edge loop before pressing the hotkeys, moving it downward won't give you the result you want. You need to move it upwards. But if your mouse was below this edge loop before pressing the hotkeys, you need to move it downward, the opposite of the previous case. So that's the first tip. And the second tip is that after pressing the hotkeys to activate this tool, right-clicking won't cancel it. It may seem like it did, but as you can see, if I go to vertex select mode by pressing 1 on the top row of the keyboard, and select this vertex and move it, it shows that the tool actually placed all the new edge loops directly on top of each other. And that's not good. You don't need to know why just yet, as it's a bit technical, okay? Just remember, for some tools in Blender, right-clicking doesn't cancel the effect, while for others, it does, alright? I think it's time to share the secret. Knowing this secret will help you even when testing new tools. The secret is, whenever you cancel a tool with a right-click, just keep an eye on this area in the bottom left. For example, when I activate the Offset Edge Slide tool by pressing Ctrl-Shift-R and then right-click, you can see the Adjust Last Operation window appear down here. And that's the secret. Whenever you see this window after right-clicking, just be alert. For example, if I select this edge and activate the Bevel tool by pressing Ctrl-B and then right-click here, you'll notice that the window doesn't appear. And this means the operation was actually cancelled. Alright, let's keep going. First, I make sure this edge loop is selected, then I press Ctrl-Shift-R, move my mouse, and click here. Alright, I'm gonna select this edge loop as well and offset it too. Okay, and that's done. Now, the distance of these edges from the surrounding edges is perfectly equal. And congrats to everyone with a bit of OCD like me. Okay, now I'm going to select these faces, and if I press G and try to move them backward, you'll see that it doesn't work the way that we want. So it's time to get familiar with another tool, which is as useful as Bevel, and that's Extrude. To activate it, just press E, and you'll see that the correct axis is selected by default. And all you have to do is move your mouse to extrude these faces inward. Alright, one interesting thing here is that, unlike when we used the Loop Cut tool, where we couldn't navigate the scene while the tool was active, with Extrude, you can still orbit the view. But not just by using the middle mouse button alone, you have to hold down Alt as well. See, even while the Extrude tool is active, I can still orbit around. But it's better to get used to the previous method, which means after selecting the components, first switch to the desired view angle. For example, I'll go to the right view, then press Alt-Z so I can better see what's happening inside the mesh. Then I press E to extrude and move it about here. Okay, I click, and that's that. Just note that Extrude is one of those tools where if you right-click, it seems like the operation was cancelled, but as you've learned, you can see in the bottom part of the screen that it actually wasn't. So, if I select these faces and move them, you see that they were actually created on top of each other. As you saw, we were able to model the empty space for the drawer in this mesh pretty easily. And now the problem is that we can't see the indentation clearly due to the lighting and shading. So I think it's time to get familiar with some viewport setting and make our work look more appealing. Once you get the hang of these settings, I promise you won't be able to resist using them all the time. At least, I know I can't resist, and I've held back for 6 episodes so far, but I can't take it anymore. From now on, I'm always going to start modeling with these settings on. Alright, the viewport settings are located in the top right corner, and for now, we'll only focus on the shading section. So we'll get to know the other options in detail later, so try not to get too distracted. First, make sure that among these 4 viewport shading options, the solid display option is selected because we want to open the setting for it by clicking on this small arrow. And I bet you're tempted to click on the other options too. And while nothing major happens when you do, one day you'll fall in love with them. They definitely need some explanations, so don't rush into it just yet. Alright, I'll click on this small arrow again, and in this lighting section, you have 3 modes: Studio, Matcap, and Flat. When you select each of them, some of the lower options will change accordingly. You can also click here to check out different light options. Keep in mind that these are just settings for the viewport and won't affect your final render. Alright, for now, we need to select the Studio mode. You can choose whichever option you like, but I'll stick with the default one for now. There are many options here, but we'll focus on just 2 for now. The first one is the shadow option. You can see that by enabling it, we can simply view the shadows. You can also adjust the darkness with this slider. Alright? The next option is Cavity, which, when enabled, opens up its own settings. You'll notice that the edges of the objects are now highlighted. And just by enabling these 2 options, the object looks much cooler, more visually appealing, and most importantly, easier to understand the shape, just compared to how it looked before. Huge difference, right? Okay, you can also tweak the cavity settings if you want to achieve your desired result. For example, I've set the cavity type to both, so the settings for both word space and screen space are displayed below. In the word space section, the ridge option controls the white highlight around the raised edges, and the valley option darkens the recessed edges. kind of like ambient occlusion, making the areas where 2 or more edges meet darker, okay? The reach and value options in screen space do the same things, but the difference is that they only affect the edges themselves, not the surrounding areas. You see that they make these edges highlighted and darken these inner edges. It's kind of like a stroke effect. Pretty cool, right? You can adjust these settings however you feel comfortable, and now you can go back here and select the light setup you like the most. Alright? I'll press the / to see how the other objects look together with these settings, and it's perfect. Now I'll select the drawer object and go into local mode, and let's create the empty space inside the drawer. I'll go to the back of the object, select this face, and now we need to get familiar with another tool that will allow us to define the thickness of this drawer. By pressing the I key, I activate this new tool called Inset. Okay, I'll move my mouse to define the drawer's thickness, and I think this amount looks good. So I click, and now we need to extrude this backward. I'll bring back the other meshes with the /, go to the right view, activate X-ray mode with Alt-Z, and then press E to extrude. I'm gonna bring it to about here, okay? I'll go back to local mode, select this top face, and now we need to hollow out this part for the drawer, right? For this, I'll press I again, and use Inset to define its thickness. I'll go to the right view, press Alt-Z, and then extrude this mesh downward, like this. Now we need to match these edges so that the gap between them disappears and the drawer fits perfectly into this empty space. Alright? Please pay close attention to this part. Right now, I'm in local mode and also in object mode, right? I select the drawer and press the Edge key to hide it so I can easily select the inner faces. Then I switch to edit mode. For example, I select these faces. And now, notice that I want to scale them on the x-axis to bring the two sides closer together. But now I need to unhide the drawer, right? However, if I press Alt-H to unhide everything, you'll see that the drawer doesn't come back. So, make sure to first return to object mode and then press Alt-H to bring the drawer back. Then switch back to edit mode, and Blender remember which faces you had selected last. Looks like some faces got selected by mistake. Let me quickly deselect them by holding down Alt and clicking and dragging, alright? And now we can scale the edges on the x-axis to bring them closer to the edge of the drawer. So you've learned something new, right? The hotkeys H and Alt-H are generally used for hiding and unhiding things. However, in object mode, they work for meshes, and in edit mode, they work for components. For example, don't accept hidden objects to unhide in edit mode when you press Alt-H, okay? It will only unhide hidden components. I hope that makes sense. Okay, let's get back to work. As you saw, I brought the two sides closer, but this caused the surrounding edges to become slanted and lose their vertical alignment. And that's why it would have been better to move the vertices instead of the faces. So let's do it the right way now so you can see the difference. This time I activate vertex select mode, and in X-ray mode, I select these vertices. I hold down Shift and add these vertices to the selection. Alright, I press S and then X and scale them, like this. Now you will see the same thing happens as before, but this time our mesh is more organized and the edges didn't get slanted. Okay, next let's do the same thing for the top and bottom parts. Just select the top and bottom vertices, press S, and this time scale them on the Z-axis. Done. We can move the drawer to check if it's in the right place or not. And if you want, you can turn off shadows to avoid any confusion. Alright. Now let's add a bevel modifier, but here you can see I need to apply the scale first, okay? So I press Ctrl A and click on scale. Now let's add bevel, and as you can see, there is no problem with the outer edges. But for the inner edges, we have an issue. The problem is with the bevel settings. To make it easier to see, I press Ctrl W to activate wireframe mode, though if you try it, nothing will happen because I've set up a custom shortcut for it. But you can activate it by going to viewport overlays here and enable wireframe. You can also right click here, select assign shortcut, and set up your preferred hotkey for it. In my case, since I already assigned Ctrl W, it shows change shortcut instead. Alright, now let's back to the bevel modifier. The problem lies in the way the mesh is structured at the corners. You can fix this by going to the geometry section of the bevel modifier and changing the mirror outer option. Right now, it's set to sharp, which is what you see right now. Patch changes the mesh like this, which still isn't what we want. And finally, arc is exactly what we need. you'll see that the mesh now follows the curve correctly and giving us the proper edge flow. To fix shading issues in these areas, just apply a subdivision surface modifier and change levels viewport to 2. For the drawer, you can simply copy the modifiers from this object. First, select the drawer, then select this object, press Ctrl L, and choose Copy Modifiers here. Now hide this object and wow, a new problem. Alright, to fix this, let's first swap the order of these modifiers. And now, you might notice that the problem seems to get worse. But don't worry, there is an easy fix. Just change the subdivision method from cat-mul-clark to simple. And you'll see that the issue is mostly resolved. Okay? Now increase the segments in the Bevel Modifier, and you can also increase the levels viewport if you like. And that's it. If this seems a bit complicated, that's totally normal. For now, I just want you to follow along and do exactly what I'm doing. In the next episode, I'll explain the subdivision surface modifier in more detail and you'll get more familiar with it. But for now, it's important to just experience this process without worrying too much about the logic behind it, okay? Just don't worry. By the next episode, I promise your mind will be more ready to understand how these tools work. Alright, now let's move on to the drawer handle and finish up this project. To start, I want to create a cube on the surface of the drawer. For this, we can use the 3D cursor. So let's go ahead and do it. By switching to edit mode, I'll select this face. Do you remember the shortcut for moving the cursor that we used in the previous episode? That's right, Shift S. Previously, we used cursor toward origin. We simply move the cursor to the center of the scene. But this time, we can click cursor to selected, which places the cursor right in the middle of the selected face. Okay, now if I switch back to object mode and create a cube, you'll see that the cube is created exactly where the cursor is located. Okay, I'll scale it down, and as you can see, the cube's object origin is exactly on the cursor. So now you've learned another use of the cursor, right? The primitives you create will be placed exactly where the cursor is. Alright, we don't need the cursor here anymore, so I'll press Shift S and click on cursor toward origin to return it back to the center of the scene. Now I'll go to the front view, activate X-ray mode, and select our favorite subdivision surface modifier from the modifier properties. Okay, this modifier is so useful that it even has its own hotkey. Okay, let's test it. First, I delete this modifier by clicking on this X icon here. Make sure you're in object mode, select the mesh, and this time press Ctrl 1. Just make sure you're using the numbers on the top row of the keyboard, not on the numpad, okay? If you press Ctrl and use number 1 on numpad, it will take you to the back view instead. So use the numbers on the top row of the keyboard, okay? So I press Ctrl 1 and you'll see the modifier has been applied. You can also set the levels viewport by holding down Ctrl and pressing any number from 1 to 5. For example, if I press Ctrl 5, the subdivision surface modifier will be applied with levels viewport set to 5. Alright, I'll press Ctrl 3 because setting levels viewport to 3 is good enough for now. Then I'll press S and then X and scale it along this axis. Okay, I match it up with the reference. I'll also scale it a bit along the Z axis. Pay attention that I'm matching it with this inner line because we're going to add this edge later, and that's it. Now I'll switch to the right view and adjust the scale along the Y axis. Alright, let's enable Shader Smooth. Now we need to delete half of the faces on the back because we don't need them anymore, right? If I press Tab, you'll see that I still don't have access to these faces. So what should I do? If you watched the previous episode, you might have guessed that we need to apply the modifier. But before applying it, set the levels viewport back to 2 since we are going to apply another subdivision surface modifier later, alright? Now I'll go back to the object mode and apply the modifier from here. And remember, the apply option is disabled in edit mode, so this is a little reminder from the previous part. Alright, I'll select these back faces, press X, and choose faces to delete them. Great. Now I'll press Ctrl R to activate the loop cut and add an edge loop here. I'll exit local mode and press 3 to switch to face select mode. By holding down Alt and clicking on this edge, I can select all the faces along this edge loop. Make sure not to click on the face itself. Just click on the edge. Alright, next I'll go to the front view, and this time we'll use a different type of extrude. For this, press Alt-E, and here choose extrude face along normals. Alright, now move your mouse to adjust it. Okay, click to confirm. Now you go back to object mode and press Ctrl 1 to apply the subdivision surface modifier we wanted, okay? I'll enable shade smooth as well. And I think setting levels viewport to 2 is better. Okay, I'll return to edit mode, press Ctrl R to activate the edge loop tool, and click here to add an edge loop in this area to make the edge we created more pronounced. Okay, and that's it for this section. Next, I'll go to the front view, hold down Shift, and right-click around here to place the cursor. I'll create a UV sphere, scale it down, and move it a bit forward. I'll also enable Shade Smooth, then I'll apply a Mirror Modifier. Okay, after selecting the object, I'll enter Edit Mode, select this vertex, and press Shift S, click on Cursor to select it to place the cursor in the center of the object. Alright, then I'll select the sphere, right-click on it, and choose Set Origin to 3D Cursor, so that the origin of this sphere aligns with the cursor. Okay, so since the default axis in Mirror Modifier is set to X, the mirror is applied correctly. Alright, this is one of the advantages of modeling your object along the correct axis. As you can see, many of the default settings in the modifiers are designed to work without needing adjustments, assuming you model on the correct axis. Now to create this object, we can use an interesting method, a new item in Blender called Curve. To do this, I'll press Shift A. So far, we've only been working with meshes, right? But here we have curves, which are a different type of data. I'll choose Path from the options, and in the outliner, you'll notice that its icon is different from the mesh icons, right? When you enter Edit Mode by pressing Tab, you'll see that we no longer have the components we had in mesh. Instead, we're working with these points. You can move, scale, or rotate them if you want, okay? It's that simple. I'll press A to select all the points and scale them down, then move them over here. I'll also adjust their position in the right view. Alright, now by selecting and moving these points, I'll try to position the main black line here, which is the actual curve, right in the center of this section. So it follows this curve shape, okay? Remember that the orange points and lines are just helpers, allowing us to shape the black line, the actual curve, exactly how we want it, okay? Just press G to move them. Keep in mind that we're going to give it some thickness, so we're aiming to place it right in the center of this tube-like shape, okay? Now I'll press Tab to make it easier to see, alright? That's good. Next, I'll apply a mirror modifier to it. And now to add thickness to the curve, click on this icon called Object Data Properties, which looks just like the icon in the outliner. Keep in mind that if you have a mesh selected, you won't see this icon. Instead, you'll see the Object Data Properties related to the mesh. So, remember that only the first 7 options in this section are always visible, and the other properties appears or disappears based on your selection. Alright, I'll select the curve again, go to Object Data Properties, then in the Geometry section under Bevel, I'll adjust the depth to get the thickness I want. Alright, I'll enable Shade Smooth. Here, if you change the resolution to 0, you'll see the profile turns into a square, and as you increase the value, more edges are added, making the profile rounder, okay? I think a value of 4 should be enough. The cool thing is that you can go back to Edit Mode anytime and adjust the curve. For example, you can select a point, press E to extrude it, and shape it however you like. It's really powerful and useful, okay? Now I'll go to the right view, press A in Edit Mode to select all the points, and then press R to rotate them a bit. I think this looks good. Now let's add a cylinder for this part. I'll select this vertex, press Shift S, choose Cursor to select it, then I'll create a cylinder, scale it down, rotate it 90 degrees, and adjust its thickness using Scale. I'll also scale it along the X-axis to make it longer. Alright, I'll enable Shade Auto Smooth, go to the right view, and position it correctly. Now I'll select the cap faces, press I to inset them, and I think this amount is good. And now with these 2 faces selected, we can use a new tool called Bridge Edge Loops to create a hole in the middle of the cylinder, okay? Since the tool's name mentions edges, we should look for it in the Edge menu, right? So, go to the Edge menu, and here click on Bridge Edge Loops. Alright, that's it. I'll adjust the position a little bit too. And yeah, that's it everyone. We've finally finished modeling Andy's nightstand. Congratulations again as always, and see you in the next episode.